Good morning or good afternoon if you are in Abu Dhabi. I'm Hannah. I'm a research fellow with the Catalyze project. We're based in the UK and Berlin, so in Birmingham and Berlin. And I'm presenting this paper on behalf of my co-authors here. And our research is going to be on using causality detection to measure media bias in reporting on Palestine. So this presentation will just be a short overview of our paper, where we are using causal extraction to measure media bias in reporting on the Israeli aggression, specifically on Palestine. And we will focus mainly on the framework and methodology and present some of our results. And for a more in-depth look, we hope you'll check out the full paper when it's available. I think that it's not quite online yet, but when it is available. Okay, I'll get right to it then. So some of you might have seen this picture before. In February last year, it spread rapidly on social media. This image juxtaposed two tragic events that occurred within the same week, but in different parts of the world. Both headlines are from the BBC, yet they employ very different language and grammar to describe these events. On the left side, on the reporting on Gaza, you can see a passive voice and euphemistic language such as found dead rather than killed, used to describe a very similar event to the one on the right, where there's very active language being used and a very strong word like killed. And the actor here is the Russian strike is explicitly named. In journalism, this is known as the missing cause bias or causal attribution bias. It's a special type of information omission that consistently avoids attributing responsibility, placing blame, or giving praise to specific actors. Causality attribution in media bias can be done by outright omitting causes, simplifying causal mechanisms, or attributing false causes. Another example in this headline by CNN was very helpfully corrected by CNN readers on the internet in order to actively tell us who the perpetrator is. And instead of using passive language like leaves 22 people dead, tells us that these people are actually killed. So it is within this framework that we aim to measure media bias. By measuring causal headline prevalence, we can show a clear bias between outlets that report on Palestine. We also compare this reporting to reporting on the Russia-Ukraine conflict in order to help us by providing kind of a control group and to control for editorial style. So Catalyze, which is our research group, is already interested in using NLP for causal mining. It's as part of our research on climate change. For a while, we've been using burst-based models for both causal sequence classification and causal extraction. Causal sequence classification is a binary task. It labels sentences as either causal or non-causal. Causal extraction is more complicated. It is a named entity recognition task. It extracts spans from sentences, spans that are either the cause or the effect. So with that, in March 2023, we set out to use this model to quantify BBC's bias, or specifically its missing cause bias. However, after much data collection, we settled on looking at three different media giants: AJ, which is Al Jazeera, BBC, and CNN. We focused on headlines. Headlines are designed to grab attention and reinforce preconceptions and leave a lasting impression. So we collected the news articles from these outlets for Palestine starting from October 8, because that is when the Nakba escalated, or rather the conflict escalated and the aggression escalated. We also collected data from Ukraine for comparison, but that went back a couple of years. So all these outlets were quite helpful in that they had a specific subpage. They either termed this Israel-Palestine conflict, Middle East war, or Israel-Hamas war, something like that. So they were quite easy to steal or scrape and collect. In table 1, we have the statistics for the corpus of all these collected articles. A region tells us the location where the conflict is occurring, and source refers to the news organization, Al Jazeera, BBC, or CNN. And N is the total number of articles, therefore the total number of headlines. And in parentheses, you can also see the proportion from this source to the total number of headlines that we got. We looked at 2 models for classification. First one is called Unicausal. It is a BERT-based model, and it was developed by Tan based on Roberta and trained on news articles. So it seemed perfectly designed for our specific purpose. However, we found that using GPT-4o, which is a generative pre-trained transformer, it yielded much better results with minimal prompt engineering. And you can see this here, this table 2 is for the results for sequence classification when compared to human labeled data, which we collected ourselves, and using a code book that we also designed ourselves for causal language. You can see this is even more pronounced in the next table for the span detection. You can see that GPT-4o vastly outperforms unicausal. So in the end, we ended up sticking with GPT for the labeling for the rest of the corpus. So what did we find? After annotating all the headlines with GPT 4.0, we compared the percentage of causal sentences in different media organizations and across both conflicts that we chose to look at. You can see in table 4, we're looking at all the articles that we collected, regardless of the topic. So all of the Middle East articles versus the Russia-Ukraine articles. And we see just the percentage of positive versus negative sequence, that is the percentage of causal headlines versus non-causal. So 50% of the Al Jazeera headlines from the Israel-Palestine subset were causal, and only 35% of the BBC's were causal. In table 5, we first restricted all of the headlines to only look at headlines that were talking about violent deaths or destruction or aggression specifically against Palestinians in the first column and Ukrainians in the second. And then from that subset, we looked at how many times Israel is specifically referred to in the causal span. So, well, Israel in the first column and Russia in the second. And here we can see a much more pronounced difference. 40% of Al Jazeera's articles will reference or will specifically name Israel as the aggressor, as opposed to only 13% of BBC's articles and 25% of CNN's. In contrast, when looking at, when they're talking about Russia, they are more or less the same, still a little bit more on Al Jazeera's side, but the difference is much less pronounced. So one thing that we weren't sure of here is whether or not these headlines are talking about the exact same events. Perhaps Al Jazeera is just covering more of these events or different kinds of stories. This was also a criticism we got from from some of the reviewers. So we decided to also align these sentences, align the headlines specifically. So to test that, we aligned the headlines using cosine similarity and restricted them to 2 days temporal windows. So we could make sure that these headlines are referencing the same event. So here we have a sample of these 200 or so headlines, only 3 of them, just to show what it looks like. In the first example, it's a non-causal sentence. It's just talking about a truce, but all 3 headlines are referencing the same event, which is extending the truce. The second and the third samples here, they're more what we're interested in. They're what we're studying. So you can see that AJ's and BBC and CNN are all talking about the same event, which is the strike on the hospital. But whereas AJ is willing to mention the actual cause highlighted here in yellow as the Israeli air raid, BBC and CNN would rather leave things up to your interpretation by obfuscating things or maybe omitting Israel specifically. To look at numbers, Table 7 summarizes the results for these aligned headlines specifically. And a reviewer also suggested we compare these to the Russian headlines, so we did so as well. However, we only ended up with about a dozen sentences from the aligned headlines that actually fit our criteria, as in talking about specifically violence against Ukrainians. And the reason for this, I mean, there is just a much higher number of aggressive actions and much higher level of destruction. So we kind of expected that. But we just, even though we report the numbers, these aren't as pronounced as they seem because there are only a dozen sentences that ended, or a dozen headlines that ended up here. However, we can see a clear omission bias in between Al Jazeera, BBC, and CNN, as only 10% of sentences of headlines that BBC reports actually name Israel in the cause. And here's an example on the left side. And this is the same headline or the same event with different headlines with much different language. BBC doesn't even use a causal construction in this one, and CNN does, but the airstrikes are not attributed specifically to Israel, whereas Al Jazeera is quite straightforward. This is just an example to demonstrate what the numbers are showing. So to sum up, more or less, our main findings seem to confer that there's a clear omission bias in BBC and CNN coverage, more so in BBC as well, especially when compared to Al Jazeera. And there's also clear omission bias for all of these agencies when comparing to how they speak about Ukraine. Finally, you might have seen this one as well. Language and grammar have a significant impact in media coverage. This case study only covers one of the many types of biases. And despite the limited scope of this study, we hope to quantify some of these biases and narratives in the media's coverage of Palestine and how it downplays Israel's role in the suffering of Palestinians. We hope that this can help identify bias in reporting and push for a more balanced coverage. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks to Catalyze for funding this project. Catalyze is more interested in climate change than media bias, but they were willing to support us in this work. You can find all our data and our code, all the aligned headlines at our GitHub page as well. And we're happy to take any questions. Paulina's also here, and I'm sure she will also be willing to step in if needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. This is all clear. And thank you also for being on time, or you finished before your time. So, any question? I think Nizar wanted to ask, maybe?
I did it. It's Owen, actually. Go ahead.
Okay, Owen.
Yes, I think the data is very convincing. So this is just a little quibble. I thought your very first examples, that one, your very first slide or the second slide was actually not a good example. Because if you substitute there, I wonder if you can just flip to that.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And as I said, this is just a quibble about a single slide. So,
so the first one, yeah.
Because I think the first headline on the left is really about the discovery of the dead body. Because if you replace that by, Hind Rajab killed by Israelis in Gaza days after phone calls for help, it makes no sense, right? So it's a little hard. This isn't quite as good an alignment as the next one, the CNN one. Do you see what I mean? The report, what's being reported on the left is actually the fact that a body was found, and that it happened days after calls for help. I don't know whether it was by the
I think Owen, this is a case you may not be aware of. I'm sure Hannah can maybe tell you the context of the Hind Rajab murder case.
Oh, okay.
It's sorry, Rasha, please. Sorry, Hannah, please, if you can explain it. Yeah.
Yes, of course. So this is an especially egregious case, and also this was we chose this one because it also this picture kind of went viral as well. Hind Rajab was shot by an Israeli tank, and it's just the formulation of the headline. It was never actually, just the way the headline was formulated was to just speak of it in the passive voice every time she was spoken about. So it is a very tragic story, and I do agree slightly that in what you say, Owen, they've gone a little bit. They've done some more linguistic gymnastics here in order to avoid speaking directly about how she was killed or the fact that she was shot by Israeli soldiers. But it's just a really good example to use, so I couldn't resist, especially as this was a very well-known story.
Okay, I thought some of the examples that your system actually found,
yeah,
were completely clear, right? So
yes,
here it's sort of complicated with the days after phone calls for help. What is that about? How does that, is that part of the story? I figured she was, and I admit I did not know the story. I figured she was buried under a building and called for help, and then finally she was found 6 days later or something.
Oh yeah,
so
I see what you mean.
It's sort of more complicated, yeah. Whereas some of the examples were just, apples to apples. It was just straightforward. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this example is also, because it wasn't picked up by our system, but it is one of the examples that sparked our interest in looking into this. So I don't even think that our system would have picked up this example and added it to our statistics.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. I'm going to add just a comment since I spoke. Maybe perhaps I also understand how Owen saw the example the way he did completely, and I appreciate Hannah's answer. But like for those of us who follow the news kind of a lot more closely and know about Hind's case, this was egregiously manipulated to make it look like completely different from, the child, had close like to 300 bullets shot toward her. It made major news. It's, by the way, Owen, why that building in Columbia University was renamed Hind's Hall during the protests last year. It's after this girl. And that's why there's a Hind Rajab, organization that now is identifying Israeli army, crimes and put them to the ICJ, etc. So this is actually a very important, famous case, and it's amazing how the change in the headline made the point actually of Hannah's and the team's work. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the clarification.
If I may,
Thank you.
hi, I'm Paulina, I'm a co-author. I want to thank Owen for the comment because I understand where he's coming from. Maybe if we've chosen another media source instead of comparing Russia against Ukraine and just keep it to the same example, it would have made like a more straightforward image for those that are not as familiar with the case. So I appreciate the comment as well. Or if, unfortunately, there were cases in Ukraine where there was like maybe a 6-year-old as well, something that would be like very, 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 like the other example that we have. I understand that the Hind case is like a very good example for us, but for people that might not be as familiar, we could make a more compelling image with another headline.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Maybe I'll add a suggestion to the authors also. I mean, along the lines of what you said, I agree. I mean, this has been great, the conversation about this. It makes me think like when we're discussing topics like this, the kind of the degree of the the manipulation can only be seen when more details are provided. It's almost the burden is on you guys when you describe this to say, here is actually the longer version of the story, or here is an objective narrative of what happened in both cases. Because in any situation it's impossible to find something perfectly matching, right? But at least to kind of provide the missing knowledge for others would be, I guess, part of the trick, part of the story, or maybe part of what we need to do with AI to kind of give me the longer version or find me the longer version, like with RAGs and other things like this. Sorry, another comment. I probably should stop here.
I think that's a very good point. We tend to also assume that everybody knows what we're talking about, but as Owen said, if you just look at the headlines, well, that's kind of the point. The obfuscation is kind of the point. So
Actually, this suggests that this is a challenge for AI systems to automate this. So we know how much bias detection is so complicated and also propaganda. So, but I have a question actually. I see in your statistics, you almost about 2,500 articles related to Gaza. Yeah, exactly. And the same related to Ukraine. So you analyzed the headlines manually, right?
So we only analyzed about 200 headlines manually in order to pick which automatic model worked better, and then the headlines were analyzed by GPT-4o.
But then
some of them were analyzed manually.
Are you biased in selecting the 200?
Sorry, say again? Ask again?
Maybe you have some bias on selecting which 200. You said, yeah.
Paulina, can you?
How did you select?
It-
How did you select the 200?
It was a random weighted sample to create the validation set.
Okay. 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 So, other questions? Actually, we are on time. Okay. Thank you very much.